The non-belief is incoherent omnibus. Number 2. The argument from the null hypothesis. Premise 1. The null hypothesis presumes non-existence until there is sufficient evidence to substantiate existence. In scientific research, the null hypothesis is the claim that the effect being studied does not exist. Premise 2. Beliefs are propositional attitudes that manifest in reality as corresponding neural activity. A number of philosophers have suggested that the content of one's beliefs depends entirely on things going on inside one's head, and not at all on the external world, except via the effects of the latter on one's brain. Consequently, if a genius neuroscientist were to create a molecule-for-molecule duplicate of your brain and maintain it in a vat, stimulating it artificially so that it underwent exactly the same sequence of electrical and chemical events as your actual brain, that brain would have exactly the same beliefs as you. Premise 3. There is insufficient evidence to substantiate the existence of a difference in neural activity between not believing a claim and believing its negation. A distinction in the neural activity that corresponds to non-belief and the neural activity that corresponds to disbelief, or belief in the negation, has not been substantiated, nor has any independently verifiable means to distinguish between them been provided. This is a distinction without a difference fallacy. A distinction in concepts does not substantiate a difference in the phenomena to which the concepts refer. This is a reification fallacy. A distinction in the terminology does not substantiate a difference in the phenomena to which the terms refer. This is a semantic fallacy. There exists a concept of instantaneous travel from one location to another. We have a term for this concept, teleportation. Neither the concept nor the terminology makes teleportation real. Non-belief is no different. Conclusion. Therefore, the null hypothesis regarding non-belief is its non-existence. Just because we should not believe without justification, or do not want to believe without justification, does not mean that belief is not present. Until and unless sufficient empirical evidence has been presented to demonstrate the claimed distinction between non-belief and disbelief, the null hypothesis is that there isn't one.
The argument under scrutiny attempts to establish that non-belief lacks a distinct existence by appealing to the null hypothesis and neural correlates of belief. It asserts that the null hypothesis presumes non-existence until evidence suggests otherwise, that beliefs are reducible to neural activity, and that there is no discernible neurological difference between non-belief and disbelief. However, these premises are flawed and the conclusion fails to hold up under logical and scientific scrutiny. Let's look at the first premise. The null hypothesis presumes non-existence until sufficient evidence substantiates existence. The null hypothesis does not presume non-existence, rather it assumes no significant effect or difference until evidence suggests otherwise. It's a methodological tool used to prevent unwarranted assumptions. In physics, the null hypothesis might not be a new particle does not exist, but there is no observed effect that indicates the presence of a new particle. It is more about the lack of demonstrated effect rather than outright presumption of non-existence. For a proposition to qualify as a null hypothesis, it must be testable and falsifiable based on empirical evidence. Helmenstein herself describes the null hypothesis differently than the sentence misattributed to her. She states, in a scientific experiment, the null hypothesis is the proposition that there is no effect or no relationship between phenomena or populations. The first step to establishing a null hypothesis is to determine the alternative hypothesis. That is to say, it is the proposition that there is an effect or relationship between phenomena or populations. These two hypotheses, H0, noted as the null, and H1, noted as the alternative, are mutually exclusive. This distinction is important in the scientific method, where hypotheses are not explicitly proven in an absolute sense. Scientific reasoning relies on falsifiability and probabilistic inference. Since it is easier to disprove a hypothesis than to definitively prove one, scientists test H0, with the goal of determining whether there is sufficient evidence to reject it in favor of H1. When testing a new drug, scientists don't assume it does not exist or does not work. Instead, H0 is stated as, the drug has no effect on blood pressure. H1 is stated as, the drug lowers blood pressure. If data shows a significant effect, then H0 is rejected in favor of H1. The null hypothesis is meaningless without an alternative hypothesis because it only exists in contrast to another proposition. The null hypothesis is not a universal presumption of non-existence, it is a specific claim that is tested against an alternative. Moving on, premise 2 states, beliefs are propositional attitudes that manifest in reality as corresponding neural activity. The phrase, manifest in reality, carries with it mystical implications of another idealistic dimension where beliefs reside only to be conjured by the mind as physical concrete things. So for the sake of the argument, let me suggest an interpretation that excludes such language. Beliefs are propositional attitudes that correlate with certain neural activities. The stated quote is an interesting thought experiment that Schwitzgebel uses to describe the division between two different schools of philosophical thought. The internalists who would accept the position, and externalists who would reject it. Schwitzgebel here isn't stating this thought experiment as a matter of fact, but a point of consideration. More importantly, this is a matter of belief content, not necessarily about propositional attitudes. In an exercise to refute the internalist thought experiment, we will propose the externalist thought experiment and extend the experiment to propositional attitudes. Putham's twin Earth. Imagine two individuals, one on Earth, call them Earthling, and one on a twin Earth, call them twin Earthling. Both have identical neural processes and are experiencing the same sensory stimuli. Both are presented with the proposition, the sky is blue, and both form the belief that the sky is blue. However, the external world is slightly different. On Earth, the sky appears blue because of the physical properties of the atmosphere, but on twin Earth, the sky appears blue because of a completely different atmospheric composition, one that Earthlings would not recognize. In both cases, the belief is about the color of the sky, but the external conditions that support the belief are different. Even though both individuals have the same internal neural activity and share the same propositional attitude, they both believe the sky is blue. The content of their beliefs might differ because the external world that contributes to the formation of that belief is different. Twin Earthlings' belief is formed in a different context, leading to a different kind of meaning attached to the proposition the sky is blue. In any case, if the author is presenting Schwitzgebel's thought experiment as a way of suggesting that the internalist ought to accept the premise, then they must bridge the gap between belief content and propositional attitudes. Externalists, however, would likely disagree. They might say, yes, beliefs may correspond to neural activity, but the content of those beliefs also depends on the individual's interaction with the external world. Neural activity alone doesn't capture the full picture. Premise 3 is empirically inaccurate and fails to support the argument's claim that these cognitive states are neurologically indistinguishable. The study Functional Neuroimaging of Belief, Disbelief, and Uncertainty by Harris, Sheth, and Cohen, 2008, which shows that belief and disbelief have distinct neural correlates. In the absence of these two correlates when presented with a proposition, non-belief becomes distinguishable from disbelief. Dismissing premise 3 pretty cleanly, we move on to the conclusion. Therefore, the null hypothesis regarding non-belief is its non-existence. The conclusion of the argument does not present a proper null hypothesis, as it fails to offer a testable or falsifiable proposition. A null hypothesis must be specific and empirically testable, capable of being supported or refuted based on evidence. Additionally, for a null hypothesis to be meaningful, it must be paired with an alternative hypothesis. The argument does not provide an alternative hypothesis to contrast with the null, leaving the null hypothesis without context or substance. Without this pairing, the hypothesis lacks the necessary structure to be tested meaningfully. Upon closer examination, the argument fails on multiple levels. It misrepresents the null hypothesis, conflates belief content with propositional attitudes, and disregards empirical evidence to the contrary. Additionally, its conclusion lacks the necessary structure to function as a valid null hypothesis. Without a coherent logical or scientific foundation, the argument does not successfully demonstrate that non-belief lacks distinct existence. Instead, its premises and reasoning ultimately undermine its own conclusion.